name is Pierre-Olivier Gourancha. I'm a faculty here at UC Berkeley, and it's my honor to be the moderator for this session on the implications for the international monetary system. We'll have a presentation by Barry Eichengreen, followed by a discussion by Ellen Ray. And so we'll start right away. Barry, I'm told to remind you, you have 20 minutes, and Ellen will have 10 minutes, and then we'll have time for a discussion. The floor is yours, Barry.
Thank you for doing it, Pierre-Olivier. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Very good. So the question I want to ask is whether the cluster of innovations we have been discussing has implications for the future of the international monetary system. Much of what we have been discussing, or some of what we've been discussing, focuses on cross-border payments with new entrants seeking to disrupt established markets, but also with the incumbents responding to that disruption. So we heard about Ripple yesterday, SWIFT, which is the incumbent messaging system for affecting cross-border payments, has been responding with private and permissioned and unpermissioned blockchain experiments of its own. Western Union, which is big in the remittances space, has been doing likewise. So I think there's no question that there will be a transformation of the technology for affecting cross-border payments. But the question I want to ask here is slightly different, whether those developments will transform the operation of the international monetary system that provides the foundation for those payments. And I will argue that the answer here is not so obvious. I need to start by defining what I mean by the international monetary system. I mean the set of arrangements, both de facto and de jure, both private and public, through which three things are accomplished. Cross-border payments for both commercial and financial transactions are affected. Imbalances in payments between countries are financed, and adjustments occur so as to render both of the aforementioned sustainable. The arrangements in practice for the moment rest on the dollar. The dollar is the main vehicle through which all three of the above are accomplished. Economists, I write here, since at least Keynes, have been discomforted by the tension between the multipolar nature of the global economy and the dollar-dominated international monetary system. Keynes had a proposal for an international unit at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. That went nowhere, but I think this tension between the multipolar nature of the global economy and the dollar-dominated international monetary system has, if anything, grown more acute as the US share of the world economy has declined over time, while the dollar has, if anything, become even more dominant in cross-border invoicing, settlement, and payments. We know that the world economy runs on dollars, so any problems in US financial markets and US Treasury markets in particular, as happened last March, immediately become global problems. That global problem was successfully dealt with back in March when the Fed intervened big time in the US Treasury market, and when it separately, in addition, activated its dollar swap lines with quite a number of foreign central banks. But it's not obvious, it's not preordained that a future Fed will be so equally foresighted and accommodating. So the question is whether there might be a digital alternative to the status quo. Mark Carney while still governor of the Bank of England, suggested that there was could be a digital alternative to the status quo. His plenary at the Kansas City Fed's Jackson Hole conference a little over a year ago argued that it might be possible to create what he called a synthetic hegemonic currency as a basket or network of central bank digital currencies. And he suggested that this would, doing so would reduce the sensitivity of other economies to US financial conditions. He suggested that this would dampen the global financial cycle, but he said nothing concrete about how this so-called synthetic hegemonic currency could be created and how it would work. So I inquired with my friends at the Bank of England about this and asked for the background papers. My conclusion is that this was a bit of a provocation on Governor Carney's part. It was an attempt to think outside the box, but it needed to be fleshed out. The best analogy we have, I think, is the IMF's special drawing rights. So to remind you, the SDR is a basket of 5 leading currencies. It has existed since 1970. IMF member governments are obliged to accept it in transactions with other members that are conducted through the fund. So the question is, what advantage a digital SDR or a unit that mimicked a digital SDR, a basket of 5 central bank digital currencies, would have over the actual SDR? And I wonder whether that's the wrong question, because the SDR already is digital in a sense, just like member bank transactions with the Fed are digital already. When transactions occur in SDRs, the IMF basically makes an electronic adjustment to its accounts. Already under current arrangements. So maybe the difference would be to create a wholesale or retail SDR in the same way that we think about central banks creating a wholesale or retail digital currency. Maybe the idea is to transform the SDR into the equivalent of a wholesale CBDC so that governments can settle directly with one another in SDRs. Or maybe the idea is to transform the SDR into the equivalent of a retail CBDC so that banks, firms, and individuals can settle directly with one another in SDRs. Maybe the idea, in other words, is to commercialize the SDR, to allow it to be used in these private sector transactions. That idea has been proposed before by me, among other people, and none of those ideas have made any headway. Maury Obstfeld, who's with us today, will be familiar with IMF's most recent investigation of this question. The fund has repeatedly considered initiatives along these lines as well, which again, I would argue have not made much headway. The reasons, the obstacles are obvious enough, and they're difficult to overcome. There's little retail demand for using and transacting in SDRs because private transactions are in national currencies, not in baskets of national currencies. SDRs are not stable in terms of any national unit. The national unit is the one in which wages are paid, mortgages are denominated, contracts are written, etc. So this is the same problem that confronted the first version of Libra when it was proposed as a basket a year and a half ago or so. So it follows from that first fact that there's little official demand for SDRs because central banks prefer to hold the same currencies that their domestic private sector clients use for transactions and hedging purposes. Cross-border transactions are in national currencies because there's a large installed base of domestic transactions, both real and financial, in those same national currencies. And as I said before, those transactions are disproportionately in dollars because of the United States' historic importance in cross-border transactions because of the country's open financial markets and so forth. There's a recent literature in economics, both theoretical and empirical, to which our chair, among others, has contributed on dollar dominance that emphasizes hedging and complementarities. Complementarities like the following: because imported inputs are priced in dollars, producers will invoice their exports in dollars. Because exports are invoiced in dollars, lenders will denominate their loans to those same exporters in dollars. Because lenders' exposure is in dollars, central banks will hold dollars so they can intervene on behalf of those lenders in the last resort. Because everyone uses dollars, markets and dollar-denominated assets will be the most liquid, and nobody finds using an alternative particularly attractive. I think the issue here is complementarities, positive feedbacks, network effects, but it's also the absence at the moment of first-class competitors for the dollar. The euro is not ready because there is a shortage of safe AAA government securities in dollars for central banks and corporate treasurers in other countries to hold. The Chinese renminbi is not ready because it's only recently begun to be used in cross-border transactions. China encourages its banks and firms to use it in their cross-border transactions, but the renminbi still accounts for less than 2% of all payments through SWIFT. So it's not really ready either. The question then is whether a US CBDC, a European CBDC, a Chinese CBDC would change this. And my answer is not, obviously. With a retail CBDC, a producer importing inputs from abroad could pay its foreign supplier directly, wallet to wallet, or retail Fed account to retail Fed account without having to go through a bank. Transactions in all the relevant currencies would be a bit cheaper, but nothing else would change. The hedging advantages of invoicing one's exports in the same currency as one's imported inputs would be unchanged. The hedging advantages of borrowing in the same currency as one's exports are invoiced would remain unchanged. The liquidity advantages of doing transactions and holding balances in dollars would remain unchanged. Nobody would have a stronger incentive, significantly stronger incentive to move away from the dollar than before. What might make a difference would be a rich ecosystem of digital derivatives. If there were cheap futures and options in all the relevant currencies at all the relevant maturities, if there was a complete set of contracts, then the risks associated with currency mismatches could be easily dealt with, could be easily hedged. No currency would have a natural advantage in cross-border transactions over any other. But we know that in the real world, markets, including derivatives markets, are incomplete. We know that derivatives have costs as well as benefits. So there's a very real question of whether regulators will permit the free development of those digital derivatives, and whether if their development is less than free, they will fundamentally change the international monetary landscape. This issue of financial derivatives growing up around digital currencies is an important one, I think. If you read the second Libra white paper that came out this summer, it talks about smart contracts and digital derivatives, but it doesn't worry about the need for a lender and liquidity provider of last resort to ensure that those markets remain liquid. And we were reminded last March that even the most liquid financial and derivatives markets can quickly go illiquid. You have to get to page 54 of the second Libra white paper to find their solution to this. Their solution to this is not to hold extra reserves so that they can intervene as a lender of last resort, but to have a system of gates that recognizes that the market is illiquid and prevents people from exiting. So the conclusion I draw is that those instruments would not constitute a reliable hedge. Finally, one more point and I'll conclude. Will a digital renminbi make a difference? We discussed yesterday about how goal number one of the Chinese CBDC is to allow the authorities, the People's Bank of China, to regain control of the payment system. But I think goal number two is to promote renminbi internationalization. And the question is, would a digital renminbi make much of a difference? China Construction Bank, one of the big four Chinese banks, surveyed foreign firms about 6 months ago, and they found that foreign firms use the renminbi when Chinese firms with which they're doing business press them to do so. And they use the renminbi to a lesser extent to hedge foreign exchange risk. When their imported inputs are invoiced in renminbi, they invoice their own exports in renminbi. If that's the reason for using the Chinese currency, it's not clear why a digital version would significantly change that calculus. China is rolling out its digital currency wallet in selected cities already. It's not clear that regulators in other countries will allow retailers in South Korea or wherever to install this app. And the main reason way it's being rolled out is so tourists, once tourism gets up and running again, can use their renminbi digital wallet to pay hotel bills or pay for restaurant meals in other countries. I think it's also unclear whether retailers and banks and firms in other countries will readily take up the digital renminbi. So there was similarly a survey of retailers in South Korea a couple of months ago where they were asked, and their answer is, we are worried about data privacy and security and whether there will be an electronic backdoor built into the digital renminbi. There's one more take on this issue, which I take from the report I'm showing you here. This argues that the right way of thinking about China's CBDC is as a means of making payment, as just described, but also as a messaging system. So as a system in which a firm in China selling goods to a firm in Korea can transfer funds between their respective accounts by transferring digital renminbi and also sending the message. So what China is really building is an alternative to SWIFT. It's building a way of freeing itself, but also potentially other countries from the danger of further weaponization of SWIFT. If parties in third countries fear US government intervention via SWIFT more than they fear Chinese government intervention via the digital renminbi, then maybe there actually will be faster take-up of this alternative. So I conclude, Carney was right. The mismatch between the global economy and its international monetary system is a problem, potentially. It's a source of tension and could be a source of fragility. But Carney was wrong to suggest that advances in digital payments provide a solution to this problem. I think more likely as the euro and the renminbi grow up over a considerable period of time, they will share more of the global stage with the dollar, and eventually this imbalance between the structure of the global economy and its monetary system will subside. This will take time, however, and it's far from clear that digitalization will fundamentally alter this trajectory. Thanks.
Thank you, Barry, for this sweeping overview and bringing us back to the fundamentals. I will now turn it to Ellen Ray. And in the meantime, if any of the participants already know they'd like to ask a question to our presenter or the discussant, please raise your hand, as you know how to do, and I will call on you when we get to the Q&A part. Thank you, Ellen. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to see my friends here from Berkeley and to discuss Barry. So maybe not too surprisingly, I'm going to mostly agree with Barry, I'm afraid, on a lot of issues here. But I will try to create a little bit of discussion. So Barry told us that the international monetary system will be more multipolar, that the SDR or the synthetic hegemonic currency of Mark Carney have essentially no future, that international currency roles are complementary, so that the equilibrium we are in is quite stable, that CBDC or digital currency per se make no difference to the future of the international monetary system, or little difference, and that the RMB will probably emerge, and maybe even the euro, but it will take time. So on this, I think I am going to fully agree on the first three, and I'm going to try to be a little bit more disagreeing on the second two, even though I'm pretty close, I think, to Barry on those as well. So on the issue that the international monetary system will be more multipolar, I think this is a point of view that I share. It's linked to this idea of a shrinking hegemon in the world economy. So here you have a very simple graph of the different size of different currency areas in world output, and you see that the United States, even though still very big, is declining, and you see that China has been rising and the euro area has been declining. So there is clearly, the dollar being the hegemonic currency, there is clearly a trend for the hegemon, that is to say the country issuing the hegemonic currency right now. There is clearly a trend for that hegemon to shrink in terms of economic mass. And so that leads to something that we refer to as the new Trifing Dilemma, which it has some echo with the 1960s. So what is it all about? It's the fact that in the 1960s, while we were under the Bretton Woods system, we had the dollar, which was fixed towards gold, and we had a lot of dollar assets, dollar balances held outside the United States. These dollar balances were as good as gold, at least in theory, but of course, if you had a lot of dollar balances in the world and at the same time a limited gold stock in the US, it's not that difficult to see that you have the dollar could be victim of its own success, and you could have a confidence crisis if people started to believe that actually the dollar they had was probably not going to be redeemed into gold at a fixed parity if everybody wanted their dollar to be redeemed into gold at the same time. So that was the idea of a Trifing Dilemma. And what is the new Trifing Dilemma? Well, in the context of this shrinking hegemon, it's a relatively parallel idea. If you think about the value of the dollar as a reserve asset right now, what makes it a reserve asset? Well, it's the implicit promise that it's not going to be devalued in times of crisis, and that is thanks to the robust fiscal backing of the United States and trust and coordination of investors on that fiscal backing. If we have a lot of dollar in the world economy, because the hegemonic currency is used, as Barry pointed out, in many different functions, and a lot of people are holding dollar, then given the decrease in size of the hegemon and the corresponding decrease in size of the fiscal backing, we may have again the dollar being victim of its own success and a confidence crisis. Now that would mean switching into something else. And so what could we switch into to make the international monetary system more multipolar, to reflect better maybe the economic sizes of the different regions in the world economy? So the natural candidates are the euro, the RMB, some cryptocurrencies, some digital currencies, private or public. And indeed, this technological innovation, does it make a difference? Now, I show you an old table, which is very useful from Peter Kennan, which exemplify what Barry has discussed, which is the multiple interactions between the different roles of an international currency, the interactions between the roles of medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account, and not only these three roles, but also the interaction between the use of an international currency by the private sector and also by the official sector. So liquidity is important, invoicing is important, and there are synergies, complementarities between all these different functions. As Barry explained, if you invoice a lot in dollar, it's good to have liquidity in dollars, which leads you to have reserves in dollars, so to have a dollar as an intervention currency. And it's good to have a lender of last resort in case liquidity dries up, which is pretty key, in fact. So because of these different interactions, so not only is the equilibrium we are in probably relatively stable, and you need pretty robust challengers, but also any kind of technological innovation that is going to score very badly on some of these aspects will probably not be very much a credible candidate to replace the dollar. And so if we think about that, and we think about decentralized blockchain cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin, then it's pretty apparent that this type of technological innovation has a huge problem of scalability, of liquidity. In particular, of course, Bitcoin is almost a caricature on that because of a huge transaction cost linked to the cost of energy, because of the cost of fraud. It's a bad numeraire, it's a bad medium of exchange, it's a bad store of value. So on that account, any type of innovation which has a feature close to Bitcoin or probably Ethereum or this type of cryptocurrencies is not going to be scoring very highly as a disruptor for the international monetary system. If we have digital currencies with centralized validation, so where we go over this problem of high transaction cost and high energy cost, etc., and more robust in a way maybe technology, then we open up some new possibilities, and it's worth discussing the likelihood of the central bank digital currencies or other types of private digital currencies becoming more important there. But I would point out that it's indeed very, very key to think of these new digital currencies, to think about their characteristics and who is issuing them. So private versus public is really a key differentiating mechanism here. If we think about government issued currencies, so publicly issued currencies, whether they are fiat or whether they would be or CBDCs, well, we use them because of a legal framework, and the public, in exchange for using them, gets some public goods which are pretty fundamentals. These are financial stability, as much as possible, macroeconomic stabilization, and of course, seigniorage gives also the possibility of public expenditures. So this is a pretty fundamental set of public goods. If we think of the competitors, which, for example, an hypothetical Libra, big firm issued currency, So they could be potentially used because of an existing network of clients, which could be fairly big. So that would overcome in one go the problem of, of network of liquidity. And they could be associated with some improvement in the transaction technology. But in exchange, there would be none of these public goods that were mentioned above. What would the big firm have? Or it would be profit and data on its customers, essentially. So this is a pretty different deal. And obviously, the key difference between the two is that is the lender of last resort issues and anything which has to do with the legal framework behind the architecture of Libra, as opposed to the existing currencies that we use. So I think it's pretty fundamentally different. And because of this, what is at stake here, I do think that regulation will remain very, very strict on big firm issued private currencies. So I wouldn't see a big development of this type of currencies.
Well, I could see time, so I'll give you a few minutes.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I'm gonna speed up. And I could see, on the other hand, more development into a digital RMB. And we know that the Chinese authorities have been doing quite a lot on that. I won't come back to that. And why could that work? Maybe a little bit actually quicker than what Barry was discussing, because here we can clearly see the chain between currency of invoice to trade credit, to portfolio flows, to reserve, maybe taking place in a world which is becoming much less multilateral than where we used to be and much more transactional. So that means a world where bilateral power relation is going to be much more important, as reflected by China being able to bargain through initiatives like the Belt and Road initiatives, through bilateral commercial transactions between the different sets of countries, and with, for example, establishing swap lines to be a lender of last resorts in certain regions of the world. So clearly, I think the decline of multilateralism here towards a more transactional world maybe could quicken the transition towards more use of a digital RMB. And I'll just show you quickly some data on the importance of China in the world. We know that China has been lending a lot more in the world economy. We know that a lot of countries are actually indebted to China. Through commercial transactions and through debt payments, we can see that there could be some complementarity here in the use of RMB as a currency of trade and a currency of debt. Now, all that could be facilitated, I would argue, by the switch to a digital RMB with more lock-in properties for people using a digital RMB across the border. So I would be, in a way, using the same data that Barry showed us to argue that, well, if you think we're in a world where bargaining power actually matters more now, essentially all the motives that you have told us people have been arguing made them use the RMB will show up more and more in the world where the bargaining power of China is increasing. You're going to use it to get better rates from suppliers. Well, the Chinese suppliers certainly will do better rates if you use RMB. Use it to get more business. Similarly, use it when the counterparties require it, for sure. So you're going to see more of that, and I would argue quicker adoption. Now I'm going to finish on showing you this graph. We are in a world in which the financial payments are dominated by the dollar, but if we look at the world network in terms of trade, here trade in value added, you see that the size of the US and the size of China are pretty comparable, and China is very much at the center of a network, just like the US is in a way. And you see another sub-network, which is the European sub-network. So clearly from this complementarity of use in trade via payment currencies, plus a bit of collapse of multilateralism, I would argue that maybe we are ripe for a world in which the multipolarity is going to be coming quicker when we think, especially, well, of course, November will also have something to say about that. And let me stop here.